Oliver had never expected his life to change on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a bag of groceries up 3 flights of stairs for a woman he barely knew. At 24, he was doing his best to scrape by, juggling part-time jobs while dreaming of a career in graphic design. His apartment was a cramped studio with a single window that faced a brick wall. Most of his furniture came from curbside giveaways or thrift stores, and his diet consisted mainly of instant noodles and discounted bread from the bakery down the street. Despite his struggles, Oliver had a kind heart. His mother had raised him to treat people with respect, to offer help when he could, and to believe that small acts of kindness made the world brighter. This belief kept him going, even when his landlord's reminders about late rent felt like a dark cloud hanging over his days. That Tuesday began like any other. Oliver had just finished a grueling 8-hour shift at the coffee shop and was headed home when he saw her near the grocery store. The elderly woman was clutching 2 heavy bags, her frail frame bent under their weight, as she shuffled slowly toward the bus stop. Without hesitation, Oliver walked over. "Let me help you with those," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman looked up at him, her blue eyes wary for a moment before softening into a smile. Her silver hair was swept into a neat bun, and her floral dress fluttered lightly in the breeze. "That's very sweet of you, young man," she said. "I was just trying to catch the bus, but it looks like I'll miss it." "Don't worry about the bus," Oliver replied. "Do you live far? I can carry these for you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Not far. Just a few blocks. My name is Margaret, by the way." "Oliver," he said, picking up the bags. They were heavier than they looked, filled to the brim with fresh produce, canned goods, and a loaf of what looked like homemade sourdough bread. As they walked, Margaret chatted about her day, her voice steady but tinged with the weariness of age. She told him about her late husband, Harold, and how she had lived in the neighborhood for 50 years. Oliver listened politely, nodding as she reminisced about simpler times, when everything felt more affordable and neighbors looked out for one another. When they reached her building, Oliver followed her up the stairs, still carrying the groceries. The apartment door creaked open to reveal a cozy but modest home filled with warm light and a faint scent of lavender. Potted plants lined the windowsills, and photos of smiling faces covered the walls. "You've been such a help," dear Margaret said as Oliver set the bags on her kitchen counter. "Let me at least give you something for your trouble." She reached for her purse. But Oliver shook his head. "It's really no trouble at all," he said, stepping back toward the door. Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You're a kind soul, Oliver. The world needs more people like you. I hope you'll come by for tea sometime." He smiled, unsure if he would take her up on the offer. "Maybe," he said. "Take care, Margaret." Back in his apartment, Oliver thought about the interaction as he boiled water for his noodles. There had been something comforting about Margaret's presence, as though helping her had momentarily lifted the weight of his own struggles. The following week, they crossed paths again. Oliver was returning from the laundromat with a basket of clothes when he saw Margaret outside her building. She was wrestling with a stubborn lock on her mailbox, and Oliver stepped in to help. "You've come to my rescue again," she said with a laugh as he handed her the bundle of letters. From that day on, their paths seemed to cross more often. Margaret would wave to him from her window as he walked to work, and Oliver found himself stopping by her apartment occasionally to help with small tasks, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, changing a light bulb, or simply sharing a cup of tea. Her stories became a regular part of his week, and he began to look forward to their conversations. But the comfort of Margaret's friendship couldn't erase the challenges he faced. His hours at the coffee shop had been cut, and his freelance design gigs were too few and far between to make a difference. Rent was due in a week, and he was still $200 short. One afternoon, as they sat in Margaret's kitchen sipping tea, she seemed to notice the slump in his shoulders. "You've been quiet today," she said gently. "Something on your mind?" Oliver hesitated, unsure if he should burden her with his problems. But her steady gaze made it hard to brush off. I got a letter from my landlord, he admitted. I'm short on rent, and I don't know how I'm going to come up with it. It feels like no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. Margaret's expression softened. Without a word, she rose from her chair and went to fetch her purse. What are you doing? Oliver asked, alarmed. Margaret pulled out her checkbook. I'm helping, she said simply. No, Margaret, I can't let you. Hush, she said, cutting him off with a firm look. You've done so much for me, Oliver. Consider this a thank you. Besides, I want to. She quickly wrote out a check and handed it to him. When he saw the amount, exactly what he needed to cover the rest of his rent, his throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand. You don't have to thank me, she said. Just promise me one thing: when you're in a position to help someone else, you'll do the same. Oliver nodded, overcome with gratitude. That night, as he handed his landlord the full rent payment, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Margaret's generosity had given him more than just a roof over his head, it had given him hope. Little did he know, Margaret had much more in store for him. For the first time in months, Oliver felt like he could breathe. Margaret's help had been a lifeline, and while he still couldn't shake the lingering worry of making ends meet, her words about paying it forward stayed with him. Margaret, however, showed no signs of treating her gesture as extraordinary. In fact, she acted as though nothing had changed between them. She still called him to help with small errands, like moving a potted plant to a sunnier spot or untangling her notoriously finicky Christmas lights. One afternoon, as they were organizing her pantry, Margaret asked a question that caught him off guard. If you didn't have to worry about money for a while, what would you do, Oliver? He paused, a can of soup in his hand. I'd focus on my graphic design, he admitted. Really give it a shot. Right now I'm just trying to take any small job I can find, but I'd love to work on bigger projects. Maybe even start my own studio someday. Margaret smiled as she placed a box of crackers on the shelf. Someday sounds like it's too far away. Why not now? Oliver gave a small laugh. Because starting a studio takes money. And I'm not exactly rolling in it. Margaret's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing more on the matter. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and more time spent at Margaret's apartment. On a chilly Saturday morning, Margaret invited Oliver to join her on an outing. I need to pick up a few things, and I could use your company, she said. They took the bus downtown, chatting as they rode through the city streets. Margaret led Oliver to a bustling shopping district, and he found himself following her into an upscale boutique. The shelves were lined with elegant scarves, polished leather handbags, and glimmering jewelry. Oliver felt out of place immediately. His thrift store jacket and worn sneakers seemed even shabbier under the boutique's bright lights. Margaret, however, moved through the store with ease, greeting the shop attendants like old friends. Is this where you normally shop? Oliver asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Margaret chuckled. Not always, but I do enjoy treating myself every now and then. Oliver watched as she picked out a silk scarf and handed it to the cashier without hesitation. The price tag was in the triple digits, and yet Margaret didn't blink as she paid. You really know how to enjoy the finer things, Oliver said as they left the shop. Margaret smiled, but her tone was thoughtful. Money is just a tool, Oliver. It can't buy happiness, but it can make life easier, and sometimes it can bring a little joy. The trick is not letting it define you. Her words stayed with him as they continued their errands. On their way home, they passed a homeless man sitting on the curb, his hands outstretched. Margaret stopped and opened her purse, pulling out a crisp $20 bill. She handed it to the man with a warm smile. Thank you, Ma'am, the man said, his eyes wide with gratitude. As they walked on, Oliver couldn't help but ask, You're really generous, Margaret. You don't seem worried about money like most people I know. Margaret's smile turned wistful. I've had my fair share of worry, she said. But I learned long ago that the more you give, the more you receive. And not just in money, kindness has a way of coming back to you. Oliver wanted to press further, but something about her tone made him stop. Margaret's financial situation was starting to feel like a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. She seemed to live modestly, or so he thought, but moments like this hinted at something more. A week later, Margaret called Oliver again. "I need your help with a little project," she said cheerfully. He arrived at her apartment to find the living room filled with boxes labeled "Donate" and Keep. Margaret was sorting through years of accumulated belongings, and she enlisted Oliver to help carry the donation boxes to her car. "You're really clearing things out," Oliver said as he stacked boxes in the back seat. Margaret nodded. "I've been holding on to things for far too long. It's time to let them go and make space for what truly matters." As they drove to the donation center, Margaret shared stories about the items she was parting with. A sweater Harold had given her on their first Christmas together, a set of china from her mother, books she hadn't read in decades. "It must be hard to let go of so many memories," Oliver said. Margaret smiled. "The memories aren't in the things, dear. They're in my heart. Besides, it feels good knowing these will go to someone who needs them more than I do." Her words struck a chord with Oliver. He thought about the way Margaret lived her life, giving freely, without hesitation or expectation. It was a quality he deeply admired, but it also made him wonder just how much more she wasn't saying. When they returned to her apartment, Margaret brewed tea and handed Oliver a steaming mug. "You've been so helpful today," she said warmly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Oliver chuckled. "I'm happy to help. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Who said anything about repaying? Sometimes helping someone is its own reward." Though her words were comforting, Oliver couldn't help but feel that Margaret's generosity came from a deeper place. There was a mystery about her, and while he didn't want to pry, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she let on. What Oliver didn't realize was that Margaret had plans that would change his life in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. A month later, Oliver arrived at Margaret's apartment expecting another errand or a cup of tea. But the moment she opened the door, he could tell something was different. Margaret's face was lit up with a smile that reached her eyes, and she seemed unusually excited. "Oliver, come in, she said, ushering him toward the living room. "What's going on?" he asked, laughing as he stepped inside. "I've been working on something," she said cryptically. "But first, sit down." He took a seat on the couch, curiosity bubbling. Margaret disappeared into the next room and returned with a thick envelope, which she placed in his hands. "What's this?" Oliver asked, his brow furrowed. "Open it," she said, her voice brimming with anticipation. Inside the envelope was a set of documents, neatly bound together, and a check. When Oliver saw the amount written on the check, his breath caught in his throat. It was enough to cover, not just a month's rent or a minor expense, but a substantial sum enough to start a small business. "Margaret, this is too much," he stammered, looking up at her in disbelief. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Margaret said firmly, sitting beside him. "And you will. But why? You've already helped me so much. I don't understand." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "Because I see your potential, Oliver. I see someone who works hard, who cares deeply, and who deserves a chance to chase their dreams. You told me about your graphic design studio, and I want to help you make it a reality." But this is— Oliver struggled to find the words. "This is life-changing." Margaret smiled warmly. "That's the idea. Harold and I always dreamed of helping others, and now that I'm in a position to do so, I want to make sure the people who deserve it most have the opportunities they need. And you, Oliver, you've earned this." Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he stared down at the check and the documents, which outlined a small business grant Margaret had set up specifically for him. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to repay me, Margaret said. Just promise me one thing, that you'll work hard, and when the time comes, you'll do the same for someone else. Oliver nodded, overwhelmed by her generosity. I promise, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Over the next few weeks, Oliver threw himself into building his dream. With Margaret's help and encouragement, he registered his business, rented a small office space, and upgraded his equipment. Word spread quickly about his studio, and before long he was working with clients from all over the city. Margaret, of course, was his biggest cheerleader. She often stopped by his office to check on him, bringing homemade cookies or simply sitting with a cup of tea while he worked. One afternoon, as they sat together reviewing a set of logo designs, Oliver turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course, dear, she said, setting down her teacup. You've been so generous not just to me, but to others too. I've always assumed you lived modestly, but it's clear you're in a very different position than I thought. How did you come to be so comfortable? Margaret chuckled, her eyes twinkling. I've been wondering when you'd ask. The truth is, Harold and I were very lucky. He was a carpenter, and we built a small furniture business together. It started out as a way to make ends meet, but over time it grew into something much bigger. Eventually we sold the business, and I invested the proceeds wisely. So you've been wealthy all this time? Oliver asked, still trying to wrap his head around it. In a manner of speaking, Margaret said with a shrug. But I've never seen myself that way. Wealth doesn't mean much if you're not using it to make the world a little better. That's what Harold and I always believed, and it's why I do what I do now. Her words left Oliver speechless. He had always admired Margaret's kindness, but now he understood the depth of her generosity. I don't know what to say, he admitted. You don't have to say anything, Margaret said, her smile as warm as ever. Just keep being the person you are, Oliver. That's all the thanks I need. As the months passed, Oliver's business continued to grow. He took on larger projects, hired a small team, and even started mentoring young designers who reminded him of himself. Through it all, he never forgot Margaret's advice to give back whenever he could. One day, as he stood in his office overlooking the bustling city streets, he thought about how far he had come and how none of it would have been possible without a simple act of kindness on a Tuesday afternoon. Oliver's studio quickly became a hub of creativity. The small, cramped space that he had started with was now bustling with energy, filled with laughter, brainstorming sessions, and the quiet hum of computers working overtime. He had hired 2 assistants, a talented intern fresh out of design school, and a seasoned marketing coordinator, who helped him bring in new clients. Through it all, Margaret remained a steadfast presence in his life. She often stopped by to see how things were progressing, her eyes lighting up at the sight of his busy office. She brought tea and cookies for his team, chatting with them as though they were old friends. Your studio feels like a family, she said one afternoon, sitting on the plush sofa Oliver had recently added to the office. That's what I want it to be, Oliver replied. A place where people can create and grow together. Margaret smiled proudly. You're doing a wonderful job, Oliver. Harold would have loved to see this. Her words touched him deeply. Though he had never met Harold, he felt as though he had come to know the man through Margaret's stories. One sunny Friday morning, Margaret called Oliver with a request. Oliver, dear, would you join me for lunch today? There's someone I'd like you to meet. Of course, he said without hesitation. When he arrived at the restaurant, a charming, tucked-away cafe Margaret often frequented, he found her sitting at a corner table with a man who looked to be in his late 50s. He had a warm smile, a well-tailored suit, and a friendly demeanor that immediately put Oliver at ease. Oliver, this is Charles, Margaret said, gesturing to the man. He's been my financial advisor for years. Charles extended a hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Margaret has told me all about your work. Oliver shook his hand, feeling slightly out of his depth. Nice to meet you too. As they ate, the conversation turned to Oliver's studio. Margaret and Charles asked thoughtful questions about his business model, his plans for the future, and the challenges he faced. "I'm proud of how far you've come," Margaret said as she sipped her tea. "But I think it's time to start thinking even bigger." Oliver frowned. "Bigger?" Charles smiled. "Margaret asked me to help set up something special for you. She believes in your vision and wants to make sure you have the resources to expand." Oliver blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Expand," he repeated. Margaret reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "Oliver, you have so much talent and heart. I want to see your studio grow into something extraordinary, a place that inspires others the way you've inspired me." Charles slid a folder across the table. "We've created a fund in your name," he explained. "It's enough to help you expand your studio, hire more staff, and take on larger projects. Think of it as an investment in your future." Oliver opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a detailed plan outlining the resources Margaret had set aside for him. The amount was staggering, more than enough to take his business to the next level. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled warmly. "Say you'll use it wisely. Say you'll keep following your dreams." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at her. "Margaret, this is too much. I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," she said firmly. "You've earned it, Oliver, and I trust you to do something wonderful with it." Overwhelmed, Oliver nodded. "I promise I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Margaret said, her voice steady. With the fund in place, Oliver began to dream bigger than he ever had before. He leased a larger office space, complete with a bright, open studio and a conference room for client meetings. He hired 2 more designers and a project manager, each of them as passionate about the work as he was. Margaret visited often, her joy evident in the way her face lit up whenever she stepped into the bustling office. "You've created something beautiful here," she told him one day as she admired the walls adorned with framed designs from past projects. "None of this would have been possible without you," Oliver said sincerely. Margaret shook her head. "Don't give me too much credit. I may have opened a door, but you're the one who walked through it." As the months turned into years, Oliver's studio became a cornerstone of the community. He took on projects that supported local nonprofits, mentored young artists, and gave back in ways that reflected the values Margaret had instilled in him. But no matter how successful he became, Oliver never forgot the simple kindness that had started it all: a bag of groceries, a creaky flight of stairs, and a warm smile from a woman who had seen something in him he hadn't yet seen in himself.